My daughter-in-law grimaced when I entered the courtroom, but when her lawyer saw my face, he instantly turned pale and began gathering his things. "Is it really him?" he whispered. My daughter-in-law nodded in surprise. "Yes. Why?" Then the lawyer stood up and said the words that changed everything. "I refuse to defend you. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments." The front door burst open without warning. Her heels clicked like gunshots across my hardwood floors. "Cornelius, this house is mine now. Rufus would want me to live here." Elmira Reyes Burns stood in my living room, designer briefcase clutched in her manicured hands, legal papers already flying from her grip onto my coffee table. The documents scattered across 40 years of family photographs, like vultures settling on carrion. I set down my newspaper slowly, my wool sweater suddenly feeling too warm. The afternoon shadows through the lace curtains caught the legal documents, making them gleam white against the dark wood of my table. "Elmira!" My voice came out steady, controlled. Decades of containing violence served me well. "You could have knocked," she laughed, sharp and brittle. "Why knock on my own property?" Her eyes swept the room like an appraiser cataloging assets. The Victorian molding, the family portraits lining the walls, Rufus's graduation photo smiling from the mantel. She moved toward the fireplace, her red coat swishing against the worn Persian rug. "You even came to your son's funeral drunk. What kind of father were you?" My hands gripped the chair arms until my knuckles went white. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, counting seconds I couldn't get back with my son. "This house holds 40 years of memories, Elmira. Memories don't pay bills." She picked up Rufus's graduation photo, studying it like she was calculating its resale value. "The court will decide who's the real owner of this house." I stood slowly, my legs stiff from sitting too long. At 65, my body reminded me daily that I wasn't the man who once commanded respect through fear, but the steel in my spine remained. "Put that down." She held the photo higher, her smile cruel. "Rufus told me how disappointed he was in you. All those missed birthdays, missed games. He said you cared more about your business than your own son." The words hit like physical blows. My jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. She was using his memory as a weapon, twisting our private pain into ammunition for her greed. "Don't you dare use his memory." She set the photo down carelessly, the frame scraping against the mantel. "That's rich, coming from a father who barely knew his own child." My fists trembled at my sides. 40 years ago, I would have ended this conversation differently. But Rufus had died believing I was a legitimate businessman, and I wouldn't soil his memory with the truth of what I'd been. She moved deeper into the house, her heels echoing off the walls like a countdown. The living room suddenly felt cavernous without her presence, empty except for the scattered legal papers and the weight of my failures. I followed her into the hallway, watching as she examined the antique fixtures with predatory interest. Her fingers trailed along the oak banister my grandfather had carved by hand, reducing family history to dollar signs. "The market value on these older homes keeps climbing." She spoke like she was already planning renovations. "Rufus always said this place had potential if someone would just modernize it. Rufus loved this house the way it was. Rufus was sentimental." She opened the hall closet, peering at my winter coats hanging there like ghosts. "Sentiment doesn't create wealth." The afternoon light slanted through the stained glass window on the landing, painting colored shadows on her face. She looked up the stairs toward the bedrooms, and I moved instinctively to block her path. "Those rooms are private." "Not anymore." She smiled again, that calculating expression that had probably charmed my son before he learned what lived behind it. "I need to see what else needs changing around here." She pushed past me toward the staircase, and I found myself following, unable to stop her, but dreading what she might find in the sacred spaces where my son's presence still lingered. Elmira's hand was already on Rufus's bedroom doorknob before I could reach the top of the stairs. "Don't." The word came out sharper than I intended. She paused, her fingers still wrapped around the brass handle. "What's wrong, Cornelius? Afraid of what I might find?" My chest tightened. That room had remained untouched since the funeral, exactly as Rufus had left it. His clothes still hung in the closet, his books still marked with business school post-it notes, his cologne still faint in the air. That's his sanctuary. Was his sanctuary. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The afternoon light through his childhood curtains illuminated everything she shouldn't see. His baseball trophy from high school sat on the dresser where he'd placed it 10 years ago. His business school diploma hung crookedly on the wall, never properly straightened after the move, home following graduation. Elmira walked to his desk, running her fingers along the surface like she owned it. She opened drawers methodically, examining the contents with the same cold assessment she'd given the downstairs furniture. "You never loved Rufus, only your dirty business deals." I stayed in the doorway, afraid to enter the space she was contaminating with her presence. "You don't know what you're talking about." He deserved a better father than a man who missed every important moment. She held up a little league medal from his childhood, the bronze dull with age. "He told me about this, said you promised to come to the championship game." My throat constricted. I remembered that promise. I remembered the meeting that ran long, the choice I made between business and my 8-year-old son. I tried to make it up to him. With money? She tossed the medal back into the drawer carelessly. "He didn't want your guilt checks. He wanted a father who showed up." She moved to his closet, pushing aside his shirts to examine the suits he'd worn to job interviews. Everything I'd missed while building an empire that meant nothing without him to inherit it. "He used to cry to me about how absent you were." Her voice carried the practiced cruelty of someone who'd been planning these words. Grown man, successful businessman, and he still cried about his daddy not caring enough to be there. "Stop." My voice cracked despite my efforts to control it. "Why? Because the truth hurts?" She pulled out his college sweatshirt, the one he'd worn every weekend when he moved back home after graduation. "He said the only time you paid attention was when he brought home awards that made you look good to your associates." I gripped the doorframe until splinters dug into my palm. The room spun slightly, memories crashing over me like waves. Every missed recital, every forgotten birthday, every phone call cut short for another meeting. This house is all I have left of my son. "Your son?" She laughed, the sound echoing off his childhood walls. "You were a stranger who happened to share his DNA. I was the one he talked to when his heart broke, when he doubted himself, when he needed someone to believe in him." She opened his bedside drawer and pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered in his neat handwriting. Business plans, career goals, dreams I'd never bothered to ask about. "Look at this." She held up a page filled with architectural sketches. "He wanted to renovate the basement into a workshop. Did you even know he was interested in woodworking?" I hadn't known. The admission sat in my chest like a stone. "He was going to ask you to help him build furniture together. Father-son project." Her smile was razor sharp. "But he never got the chance because you were always too busy counting money to count the days you had left with him." My hands clenched and unclenched at my sides. The urge to strike something, anything, built like pressure in my skull. But violence wouldn't bring him back or erase the years of choosing work over my child. She closed the notebook and tucked it into her briefcase. "I think I'll keep this." He would want his dreams preserved by someone who actually cared about them. "Don't you dare use his memory against me." "I'm not using anything." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. "I'm just telling you what your son really thought of his absent father." The floorboards creaked under her feet as she moved toward me, still clutching her briefcase full of legal papers and stolen memories. "The court hearing is next month. I suggest you find yourself a good lawyer." She paused in the doorway, her shoulder brushing mine. "One who specializes in lost causes." I heard her heels clicking down the stairs, heard the front door slam with finality. The house settled into silence, but the damage was done. His room felt violated, his memory weaponized, my failures laid bare like surgical incisions. I stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by 4 decades of missed opportunities and love unexpressed, knowing that tomorrow everything would change. After she left, the house felt even emptier than before. I stood at the threshold of Rufus's room, hesitating like a trespasser in my own home. My shoulders sagged under the weight of Elmira's accusations, each word echoing in the sudden quiet. The grandfather clock downstairs continued its relentless ticking, marking time I couldn't reclaim. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the light switch. The overhead fixture cast harsh shadows across furniture she'd touched, drawers she'd violated, memories she'd stolen. But underneath her contamination, I could still feel him here. The baseball trophy caught the light, its small bronze figure frozen mid-swing. I picked it up carefully, remembering the weight of it in his 8-year-old hands when they had finally presented it to him. I hadn't been there to see his face when they called his name. "Forgive me, Rufus." The words fell into empty air. I set the trophy back in its exact position, muscle memory guiding my movements from all the times I'd watched him polish it during high school. His graduation photo smiled at me from the wall, crooked as always. Rufus had hung it himself when he moved back home, never quite getting the angle right. I'd always meant to fix it, but never wanted to disturb his work. Now the slight tilt seemed perfect, uniquely his. I moved to his desk chair, the leather worn smooth from years of his studying. The seat still held the faint impression of his shape. My weight felt wrong in his space, too heavy, too foreign. The whiskey bottle sat on his bookshelf between business textbooks and thriller novels, a gift from me on his 21st birthday. One of the few presents I'd chosen myself, instead of having my assistant handle. I'd taught him to appreciate good bourbon that night, one of our rare moments of connection. My hands shook as I poured 2 glasses, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. One for me, one for the son who would never drink with me again. "She's wrong about us, you know." I raised my glass toward his empty chair. "You knew I loved you." The bourbon burned, but not as much as the truth in her words. I had missed his games, his concerts, his first job interview. I'd chosen meetings over movies, contracts over conversations, building an empire while my son built his life without me. But she hadn't been there for the late nights when he'd call with problems, seeking advice he claimed he valued. She hadn't seen his face when I finally made it to his college graduation, the pride that lit his eyes when he introduced me to his professors. I should have been there more. My voice cracked in the empty room. Should have shown you how much you meant to me. The cologne bottle on his dresser still held his scent, faint but unmistakable. I opened it carefully, breathing in the essence of the man he'd become despite my failures. Sharp and clean, professional, but warm, everything I'd hoped he would be. His baseball glove lay in the bottom drawer where Elmira had carelessly tossed it back. The leather was soft from years of use, shaped by his hands, marked by his dreams. I slipped my fingers inside, feeling the ghost of his grip. The last conversation replayed in my memory like a broken record. Tuesday morning, 2 days before the accident. He'd called about dinner plans for the weekend, something about trying a new restaurant downtown. I'd been distracted by emails, giving him half my attention. "Sure, son. Whatever you want." Those were the last words I'd spoken to him. Dismissive, distracted, typical. He'd deserved so much more than whatever you want for a final conversation. The hospital call had come Friday night. Car accident, they'd said. Critical condition. I'd raced through red lights and emergency room doors, but arrived too late. He was already gone, taking with him every chance to make things right. The funeral was a blur of flowers and condolences. Elmira had stood beside me in black designer clothes, accepting sympathy with practiced grace while I struggled not to collapse under the weight of permanence. Now she wanted to erase him completely, turn his home into profit margins and his memory into legal ammunition. But she'd underestimated the depth of a father's love, even a flawed father who'd learned too late how to express it. I finished the whiskey and set both glasses on his desk, leaving his untouched like a vigil. The notebook she'd taken contained his dreams, but I held his history in every room of this house. Tomorrow, I would call Ira Ramos. Tomorrow, I would fight for what remained of my son. Tonight, I would sit in his chair and remember every moment I'd been too busy to treasure when I had the chance. The afternoon was fading into evening, shadows growing longer across his childhood room. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt something besides grief stirring in my chest. Determination. The whiskey had warmed me, but the cold truth remained. I needed air, space to think beyond the suffocating walls of my son's preserved sanctuary. Evening shadows stretched longer across the hallway as I finally left his room. My legs felt unsteady, not from alcohol, but from the weight of memories Elmira had weaponized against me. The house creaked its familiar evening song, settling into darkness. My study called to me like an old friend. Leather chair worn smooth by 40 years of difficult decisions. Cigar humidor filled with Cuban tobacco that reminded me of better times. I needed the ritual, the methodical process that had always helped me think through impossible situations. The lighter flame caught the cigar's tip with practiced precision. First draw, slow and deliberate. Second draw, feeling the familiar burn that cleared my head better than any therapy. Outside, Chicago's evening traffic hummed in the distance, but inside these walls, only memory lived. The phone rang that Friday night, March 14th, 2024, exactly 1 year and 1 day ago. Mr. Burns, this is Northwestern Memorial. Your son has been in an accident. I can still hear those words echoing off the study walls, the way the nurse's voice stayed professional while delivering the news that would end my world. Racing through red lights, emergency room doors sliding open like the entrance to purgatory. He died instantly, sir. No suffering. The doctor spoke with practiced sympathy, words designed to comfort but landing like stones in my chest. Instant death. No goodbye, no final words, no chance to tell him what he meant to me. But Elmira had been there within hours, eyes dry and calculating, even as I struggled to comprehend the permanence of loss. I need money for housing costs, Cornelius. Rufus would want me taken care of. Even at the funeral parlor, while I sat numbly choosing flowers and caskets, she was talking about expenses, about her future, about what she deserved. I drew deeply on the cigar, letting the smoke fill my lungs like courage. The memories came in waves now, unstoppable as tide. 3 months after the funeral, she started selling his things. I found out by accident, driving past a garage sale and seeing his college textbooks spread across folding tables like discarded dreams. These things are just collecting dust, she'd said when I confronted her. Rufus would want them to be useful to someone, but they weren't collecting dust. They were pieces of him, fragments of the man he'd become despite my failures as a father. She turned his achievements into commodity, his memory into merchandise. While I mourned, she was counting dollars. The contrast burned worse than bourbon. I remembered his graduation day, watching him walk across that stage with pride radiating from every step. He'd found me in the crowd afterward, diploma clutched in his hands. Dad, I want to make you proud. I know I can build something legitimate, something clean. Clean. He'd chosen that word deliberately, knowing enough about my past to want something different for his future. And he'd succeeded, building a consulting firm that helps small businesses thrive. Everything I'd never been, he became. The cigar had burned down to ash between my fingers. I stubbed it out carefully, the ritual as important as the smoking. Precision in small things had always kept me centered during chaos. Another memory surfaced, darker than the rest. 2 weeks after the garage sale incident, I'd found her in his apartment with a real estate agent, discussing rental potential. The market's good for downtown properties, the agent was saying. We could have this rented within a month. His apartment. The place where he'd cooked Sunday dinners for both of us, where we'd watched baseball games and talked about business strategies. She was turning it into income property before his side of the bed had even gone cold. That night, I'd sat in this same chair, cigar burning unattended, as I realized the full scope of her betrayal. She wasn't just taking his money or his possessions. She was erasing his existence, one sold item at a time. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the anger had crystallized into something harder, more focused. Her confrontation today had been a tactical error, showing me her hand before the game was truly begun. I reached for another cigar, then stopped. Enough self-medication. Tomorrow would bring new battles, and I needed clarity more than comfort. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, marking another hour in a house that felt simultaneously too empty and too full of ghosts. But for the first time since the funeral, I wasn't drowning in the emptiness. I was planning to fill it with justice. I barely slept. Morning came gray and cold, matching the mood that had settled in my bones overnight. By dawn, I knew the real fight was coming. The coffee maker gurgled to life while I stared out the kitchen window at bare March branches. 10 months of grief had dulled my survival instincts, but Elmira's visit yesterday had sharpened them back to their old edge. Today would bring official documents, legal threats wrapped in bureaucratic language. The walk to the post office took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that remembered when I'd been someone to fear. Now I was just another old man shuffling through morning routines, invisible to the young mothers pushing strollers and college students rushing to classes. But invisible could be useful. Underestimated men often won wars that confident generals lost. Important documents, Mr. Burns. The postal clerk examined my identification twice before sliding the certified envelope across the counter. Sign here, please. My signature felt steady despite everything. Muscle memory from decades of signing contracts, agreements, orders that changed lives. The envelope weighed heavy in my hands, official legal weight that meant serious business. Outside, the March wind cut through my coat as I examined the return address. Dixon and Associates, attorneys at law. Elmira had moved faster than expected, already securing professional representation, while I'd been wallowing in memory and bourbon. The walk home felt longer, each step carrying me toward a confrontation I couldn't avoid. The envelope seemed to burn through my jacket pocket, legal fire that demanded immediate attention. My study welcomed me back like an old battlefield commander returning to headquarters. I spread the contents across my desk methodically, the way I'd once analyzed territory maps and resource assessments. Old habits, different war. Petition for property transfer dominated the first page in bold legal font. Below it, paragraph after paragraph of whereas clauses and legal justifications, all building toward one simple demand: give Elmira everything. The scope staggered me. Not just the house, but bank accounts, investment portfolios, even Rufus's trust fund that I'd established for his future children. She wanted complete financial control, total victory disguised as righteous inheritance claims. Hereby, petition for ownership transfer based on marriage rights and deceased spouses' stated intentions. Stated intentions? The phrase stuck like a fishbone in my throat. What had she told these lawyers about my son's wishes? What lies had she constructed to justify this legal theft? The court date glared at me from the final page. April 15th, 2025. Less than a month to prepare a defense against accusations I hadn't even fully understood yet. Time pressure, designed to force quick settlements and avoid prolonged battles. Smart strategy. Elmira was learning to fight dirty, using legal system timing to her advantage. But she'd made one crucial error. She'd given me a deadline to work toward. I reached for the phone, dialing a number I'd memorized but rarely used. Ira Ramos had handled my legitimate business for years, keeping my legal affairs clean, while carefully avoiding questions about income sources. He understood discretion and appreciated clients who paid bills on time. Ira, I need a lawyer. It's serious. Tell me everything, Cornelius. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd heard every possible legal disaster. What kind of trouble are we looking at? Family trouble. My son's widow is trying to take everything through the courts. I need someone who understands inheritance law and isn't afraid of a fight. The silence stretched long enough for him to consider implications. Ira had always been careful about associating with my past, but family disputes fell into safer territory than my previous business relationships. Can you be here at 4 o'clock? I'll need to see all the documents, understand their strategy before we plan our response. 4 o'clock. 6 hours to prepare for the most important meeting of my retirement. 6 hours to transform from grieving father to strategic defendant. I'll be there, and Ira? I paused, feeling the old authority creeping back into my voice. This isn't about money. This is about justice for my son. I understand. We'll make sure she doesn't win. The phone went silent, leaving me alone with legal papers and the growing certainty that Elmira had started something she couldn't finish. She'd brought lawyers and court dates to a war I'd been preparing for my entire adult life. Ira would see me in 4 hours, time enough to prepare for war, gather my weapons, and remember exactly who I used to be before grief made me soft. The grandfather clock ticked toward battle, each second bringing me closer to the moment when I'd stop being a victim and start being a force. The phone went quiet. 4 hours until my appointment with Ira. Time to remember who I used to be before grief turned me into someone who could be pushed around by a greedy widow. I spread the legal documents across my desk like battle plans, each page representing another angle of attack in Elmira's campaign. But as I studied her strategy, old instincts began awakening from their year-long hibernation. 40 years of strategic thinking don't disappear overnight. She'd made several tactical errors already. First, showing her hand too early with yesterday's aggressive house invasion. Second, filing legal papers before understanding her opponent's resources. Third, assuming I'd crumble under pressure instead of fighting back. Amateur mistakes. In my previous life, such miscalculations would have been fatal. I began pacing the study, a ritual from decades of planning complex operations. Movement helped my mind process information, organize thoughts into actionable strategies. The Persian rug showed worn paths from years of this same contemplative walking. This wasn't about money, despite what the legal papers claimed. This was about power, control, and Elmira's fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of man she'd chosen to challenge. She wanted war, she'd get it. But on my terms, fought with legal weapons instead of the crude tools of my youth. My advantages became clear as I analyzed the situation objectively. Legal ownership of the house, documented through 4 decades of property taxes and mortgage payments. Established relationships with financial institutions that predated her marriage to Rufus. Character witnesses who knew me as a legitimate businessman, not the criminal I'd once been. Most importantly, resources she couldn't have anticipated, money hidden in accounts she'd never discovered, investments made through entities she'd never heard of, connections to professional services that operated far above her experience level. Rufus's graduation photo watched from the bookshelf as I planned his mother's legal destruction. He'd wanted clean business, legitimate success. This would be both. Completely legal warfare fought with professional precision. Time to use my brain instead of my fists, I muttered to his smiling image. The strategy crystallized as afternoon shadows shifted across my desk. Defensive actions first. Protect existing assets. Secure legal representation. Document her harassment and manipulation. Offensive moves. Second, investigate her finances, challenge her claims, expose her true motivations to the court. Long-term victory required patience, something the streets had never taught me, but legitimate business had. This wasn't a matter of immediate violence ending problems quickly. This was chess, not street fighting. I pulled out a yellow legal pad, muscle memory guiding my hand, as I began outlining tactical approaches, information gathering, resource allocation, timeline management. The same organizational skills that had once built criminal enterprises now focused on protecting my son's legacy. Elmira's psychological profile emerged as I worked, greedy but impatient, confident but inexperienced, driven by financial desperation rather than strategic thinking. She'd push for quick resolution, probably hoping to intimidate me into settlement rather than prolonged court battles. Wrong calculation. I had time, money, and motivation she couldn't match. More importantly, I had professional relationships built over decades of careful reputation management. The phone rang. I let it ring 3 times before answering, a habit from years when answering too quickly suggested desperation. Cornelius Burns. Mr. Burns, this is Grace from Dr. Patterson's office. You missed your appointment yesterday. My doctor. I'd completely forgotten the routine checkup scheduled for yesterday afternoon, swept away by Elmira's invasion and its aftermath. Another sign of how much she'd disrupted my carefully ordered life. Reschedule me for next week, Grace. Something urgent came up. Of course. How about Thursday at 10? Perfect. Health maintenance could wait. Right now, I needed legal armor more than medical attention. By 4 o'clock, I had my battle plan complete. Not the crude violence of my past, but sophisticated legal strategy designed to protect what mattered, while teaching Elmira the cost of targeting the wrong old man. The documents went into a manila folder, organized chronologically and labeled clearly. Professional presentation mattered in legal warfare. First impressions that established credibility and competence. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror before leaving. Gray suit, conservative tie, appearance of respectability that had taken decades to cultivate. The man in the mirror looked like someone who belonged in law offices, not back alleys. But behind the legitimate facade, predatory instincts stirred with anticipation. Elmira had awakened something she wouldn't be able to control or predict. By 4 o'clock, I had my battle plan. Time to find my general and begin the war that would determine who truly deserved to inherit my son's legacy. The afternoon air felt crisp with possibility as I walked toward Ira's office, manila folder tucked under my arm like ammunition for the fight ahead. The elevated train clattered toward downtown, carrying me toward my first real hope in months. 2 days to prepare mentally. 2 days of sleepless planning had led to this moment. Downtown Chicago sprawled beyond the windows, steel and glass monuments to legitimate power. Different from the shadowy authority I'd once wielded, but power nonetheless. The train's rhythm matched my heartbeat as we approached the station. Ira Ramos's office occupied the 15th floor of a respectable building on LaSalle Street, legal district territory where wars were fought with briefcases instead of bullets. The elevator ride gave me time to settle into my role, grieving father seeking justice, not former crime boss planning strategy. Cornelius? Ira's handshake was firm, professional. Let's get started. His office reflected decades of successful practice. Law books lined mahogany shelves, framed certificates proclaimed his credentials, family photos showed a man who valued relationships over profit, the kind of attorney Rufus would have respected. I want to reclaim what belongs to my son's memory. I set the manila folder on his desk, documents organized with military precision. This woman is trying to steal everything he worked for. Ira spread the legal papers across his desk, reading with practiced efficiency. His expression grew more serious as he absorbed the scope of Elmira's claims. She's claiming emotional distress and financial dependency. He looked up, studying my face. But your ownership documents are solid. The house was never part of the marital property. What are our chances? Better than she probably expects. Ira leaned back, already strategizing. We'll need to prove her claims are groundless and motivated by greed, not legitimate need. I watched him work, impressed despite myself. This man understood the battlefield, knew how to read opponents and exploit weaknesses. Different weapons than I'd used, but the strategic thinking felt familiar. She made a mistake coming after you this aggressively, Ira continued. Judges don't like obvious money grabs disguised as grief. The contract signing felt ceremonial, pen scratching across official documents that formalized our alliance. For the first time since Rufus died, I wasn't fighting alone. We have work to do. Ira stood, already energized by the challenge. Document authentication, witness interviews, financial investigation. I'll need you available for the next week. Whatever it takes. As I prepared to leave, Ira paused at his office door. Your instincts about this case are remarkably sharp, Cornelius. You understand strategy better than most clients. 40 years in business teaches you to read people. He nodded, accepting the explanation without probing deeper. Some secrets were better left buried, especially when they might complicate otherwise straightforward legal relationships. The elevator descended toward street level, carrying me back to a world where I had allies instead of just memories. For the first time since the funeral, the future held possibilities beyond grief. Outside, downtown Chicago bustled with afternoon energy. Legitimate business, legal commerce, everything Rufus had built his life around. Soon, I'd be fighting in his world, with his methods, protecting what he'd valued most. As I walked toward the train station, Ira was already making calls behind his office windows. The real work was starting, and I felt ready for whatever came next. The afternoon sun caught the windows of corporate towers, reflecting light like armor. Tomorrow would bring intensive preparation, evidence gathering, strategic planning, but today had given me something I'd lost. Hope backed by professional competence. The train ride home felt different than the morning journey, less desperate, more determined. Elmira had started this war, but she'd chosen the wrong battlefield and underestimated her opponent. By the time I reached Oak Park, dusk was settling over suburban streets. But inside my chest, something that had been dormant for months was finally stirring back to life. The will to win. Ira wasted no time. By Thursday morning, we were already gathering ammunition for the battle ahead. 5 days of methodical investigation. 5 days to build an unshakable case that would expose Elmira's greed and protect my son's legacy from her predatory hands. The notary office on State Street smelled like official business and faded leather. Mrs. Chen had been authenticating documents for 30 years, her practiced eye catching forgeries that would fool amateur investigators. These documents are genuine, she confirmed, examining the property deeds and will papers. Signatures match, dates are consistent, everything appears legitimate. Ira nodded, making notes in his legal pad. We'll need certified copies for court presentation. Day 2 brought us to First National Bank, where Rufus had maintained his business accounts. The manager, a nervous man who recognized money trouble when he saw it, spoke carefully about recent account activity. Mrs. Burns has been quite aggressive about accessing funds. He shuffled papers uncomfortably. 3 large withdrawals in the past month, each one requiring special approval due to the amounts involved. How large? Ira's pen hovered over his notepad. 40,000 total. Shopping sprees, expensive restaurants, luxury hotel stays. The manager's disapproval was obvious. Not typical grief behavior, if you ask me. Evidence of financial desperation. Exactly what we needed to establish motive. Elmira wasn't just greedy. She was drowning in debt and using my son's inheritance as a life preserver. Day 3 took us through Cook County property records, dusty files that told the story of my home's ownership. Purchase documents from 1983, mortgage payments spanning decades, tax records showing consistent ownership by Cornelius Burns, never jointly held with any spouse. The house predates her marriage by 15 years, I pointed out, watching Ira photograph each relevant document. She has no legal claim to property I owned before they even met. Exactly what we need, clear, unambiguous ownership history. The witness interviews proved most valuable. Mrs. Patterson from next door had watched Elmira's behavior with growing distaste over the past year. She was selling his things before he was cold in the ground. The elderly woman's voice carried righteous indignation. Garage sales, estate sales, even tried to sell his car while Cornelius was at the funeral home making arrangements. Would you testify to that in court? Ira asked. Absolutely. That poor man deserves better than what she's putting him through. As we drove from appointment to appointment, I found myself genuinely impressed by this lawyer's dedication and thoroughness. Qualities I'd learned to value in my previous life, when incompetence could prove fatal. Your instincts about people are remarkably sharp, Ira commented during one of our strategy sessions. You read situations like someone with extensive experience in conflict. Business teaches you to analyze opponents, I replied carefully. True enough, even if the business had been less than legitimate. By Friday afternoon, our evidence files were bulletproof, financial records proving Elmira's desperation, witness statements documenting her callous behavior, property documents establishing my unshakable ownership claims. She doesn't have a chance, Ira said, organizing the final documents in his office. Any competent judge will see through her manipulation immediately. But I'd learned never to underestimate desperate opponents. Cornered animals fought hardest, and Elmira was facing financial ruin if her legal strategy failed. When's the court date? I asked. April 1st, 2 weeks to prepare final arguments and review our presentation strategy. April Fool's Day. The irony wasn't lost on me. Elmira would discover exactly who the fool was when this case reached its conclusion. The week had transformed me from passive victim to active participant in my son's defense. Working alongside Ira had reminded me of the satisfaction that came from systematic planning, thorough preparation, strategic execution. Different methods than my past, but the core principles remained the same. Know your enemy, prepare for battle, fight to win. As I left Ira's office that Friday evening, downtown Chicago glowed with the lights of legitimate commerce. Soon, I'd prove that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the battlefield chosen. The real test would come in 2 weeks. But tonight, for the first time since Rufus died, I felt ready for whatever Elmira and her lawyer might throw at us. Monday evening arrived with our case bulletproof and our confidence high. Tuesday would tell the tale, but I already knew how this story would end. Justice for my son, victory over greed, the legacy he deserved, protected by methods he would have approved. The week crawled by with sleepless nights and endless preparation. Finally, Judgment Day arrived. Cook County Circuit Court rose before me like a temple to justice, its stone columns and formal architecture demanding respect. Spring morning in Chicago, but the courthouse steps felt like walking toward destiny. 7 days of preparation led to this moment. Every document verified, every witness statement recorded, every strategic angle analyzed with military precision. I climbed those steps knowing I was ready for war. The courtroom smelled of old wood and formal authority. High ceilings, dark paneling, the judge's bench elevated like a throne commanding absolute respect. I'd been in rooms where power was exercised, but this felt different, legitimate, clean. Ira adjusted his tie, checking his briefcase one final time. Remember, Let me do the talking unless directly questioned by the judge. Stay calm, look confident, but respectful. Understood. We took our seats at the plaintiff's table, documents organized with systematic precision. The morning light through tall windows cast everything in sharp relief, clarity that matched my mental state. Then she walked in. Elmira wore a black designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Spending my son's inheritance money on courtroom costumes, playing the grieving widow while her lawyer prepared to argue for financial necessity. Her attorney followed close behind, a middle-aged man with expensive briefcase and confident stride. Grover Dixon, according to our research. Mid-level success, hungry for bigger cases, willing to take morally questionable clients if the fee was right. They settled at the defendant's table, Elmira glancing dismissively in my direction, like I was some doddering old fool she'd already defeated. Her arrogance would be her downfall, but she didn't know that yet. More people filtered into the gallery, court observers, law students, a few curiosity seekers drawn by family drama playing out in public. Not many, but enough to make this feel consequential. All rise, court is in session. The bailiff's voice echoed off courthouse walls as Judge Morrison entered, mid-50s, gray hair, expression of someone who'd seen every possible human folly parade through his courtroom. He'd heard inheritance disputes before, knew how greed could twist family relationships into legal weapons. Case number 2025 CH0847, Burns versus Burns inheritance dispute. The court clerk's voice was professional, neutral. Petitioner Elmira Reyes Burns versus defendant Cornelius Burns regarding property ownership claims. Judge Morrison reviewed the case summary with practiced efficiency. This court will hear arguments regarding the transfer of property ownership and inheritance rights. Counselors, are both parties ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor, Ira responded confidently. Ready, Your Honor, Grover Dixon answered, but I noticed him finally looking in my direction with something approaching attention. As the judge called for opening arguments, that old familiar calm settled over me like armor. The courtroom atmosphere reminded me of other confrontations, different stakes but similar dynamics. Strategy, timing, reading opponents for weaknesses. I noticed Grover Dixon studying me more carefully now, professional curiosity replacing casual dismissal. Something in my posture, my expression, the way I carried myself, despite being the supposedly helpless defendant. Elmira whispered urgently to her lawyer, probably wondering why he suddenly looked uncertain. The moment of recognition was coming, the instant when her overconfident attorney would realize exactly who he'd agreed to face in legal combat. The battle was about to begin, and I felt ready for whatever came next. Mr. Dixon, Judge Morrison continued, you may present your opening arguments. But Dixon hesitated, still staring at me with growing recognition dawning in his eyes. The confident lawyer, who'd walked in expecting easy victory, was beginning to understand this case might not be the simple inheritance grab he'd anticipated. Time to see if Elmira's hired gun had the courage to proceed once he realized what kind of man he'd chosen to challenge. As the judge reviewed the case details, I noticed Grover finally studying me carefully. His confident expression began to change. Something in my posture caught his attention, the way I sat perfectly still, observing everything with predatory patience. 40 years of commanding respect through presence don't disappear just because you're wearing a gray suit instead of giving orders in back rooms. His eyes narrowed, scanning my face like he was trying to match it to a memory. Professional recognition dawning slowly, then faster as pieces clicked into place. The color drained from Grover Dixon's cheeks. Is that really him? He whispered urgently to Elmira, papers rustling as his hands began to shake. Yes, so what? She looked at him with growing irritation. That's just Cornelius. What's wrong with you? But Grover was already standing, fumbling with his briefcase like it had caught fire. The confident attorney who'd walked in expecting easy victory was transforming into something resembling panic. I refuse to represent you. His voice cracked slightly, professional composure crumbling. What's happening? Elmira grabbed his arm, confusion replacing her previous smugness. Sit down. We haven't even started yet. Judge Morrison looked up from his papers, irritation creasing his features. Mr. Dixon, please explain this disruption. I'm withdrawing from this case immediately, Your Honor. Grover's words came out in a rush. Conflict of interest. Cannot proceed. The judge's frown deepened. This is highly irregular. You filed these papers, Mr. Dixon. You cannot simply abandon your client moments before proceedings begin. But Grover was already backing toward the courtroom door, briefcase clutched against his chest like armor. I apologize to the court, but I must withdraw immediately. I watched this display with the same calm I'd once brought to much more violent confrontations. The Iron Fist's reputation was working its old magic even in this sterile environment of marble and fluorescent lights. "Grover, stop!" Elmira's voice rose, drawing disapproving glances from gallery observers. "You can't leave me here alone." "Find another lawyer," he called over his shoulder, already pushing through the courtroom doors. "Anyone but me." The silence that followed his exit was deafening. Elmira sat alone at the defendant's table, finally beginning to understand that she knew absolutely nothing about the man she'd chosen to challenge. Judge Morrison removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly while processing this unprecedented disruption. "Mrs. Burns, do you wish to request a postponement to secure new counsel?" Elmira looked around the courtroom desperately, as if another lawyer might materialize from the gallery. Her designer suit, paid for with my son's inheritance money, suddenly looked like costume armor worn by someone playing a role she didn't understand. Yes. I need time to find someone else." Motion for postponement noted. The judge's tone suggested his patience was wearing thin. However, given the frivolous nature of many inheritance disputes and your counsel's unprofessional abandonment, this court is inclined to proceed. Ira leaned forward, sensing opportunity. "Your Honor, we're prepared to proceed. The plaintiff has been ready since filing, and delaying justice serves no legitimate purpose." I remained perfectly still, letting my reputation's shadow do work that bullets once accomplished. Grover Dixon had recognized the Iron Fist, and his terror had just stripped Elmira of professional protection. Decades of street credibility, earning their value in a place I'd never expected to need them. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Grover's fleeing figure. Elmira sat alone, finally understanding she was outmatched by forces she couldn't comprehend. Her confident mask was cracking, revealing the desperate woman underneath who'd gambled everything on, intimidating a supposedly helpless old man. But I was anything except helpless, and she was about to learn exactly what kind of mistake she'd made. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Elmira faced the court alone, her arrogant confidence crumbling like a house built on sand. "Your Honor, I request a postponement to find new counsel." Her voice carried the first hint of genuine fear I'd heard since this ordeal began. Judge Morrison's expression remained stern. "Motion denied. This court has already accommodated significant disruption. We will proceed as scheduled." Ira stood with practiced elegance, his briefcase organized like military equipment. "Thank you, Your Honor. The evidence clearly shows my client's rightful ownership of all disputed property." He methodically presented our case like a master craftsman, displaying perfect work. Original property deeds, mortgage payment records spanning decades, documentation proving the house was purchased 15 years before Rufus ever met Elmira. "These documents establish unambiguous ownership history," Ira continued, spreading papers across the evidence table. "The defendant's claims lack any legal foundation." Elmira fumbled with her own papers, clearly out of her depth without professional guidance. "Your Honor, he was a terrible father. This house should be mine by right." "Personal opinions are not legal arguments, Mrs. Burns." The judge's patience was visibly strained. "Do you have documentation supporting your claims?" She couldn't answer because no such documentation existed. Her entire strategy had relied on emotional manipulation and intimidation, tactics that crumbled under courtroom scrutiny. Mrs. Patterson testified next, her elderly voice carrying absolute conviction. She was selling his things before the poor boy was cold in the ground. Garage sales, estate auctions, everything that reminded his father of their son. "That's not true," Elmira protested, but her desperation only made her look more guilty. The bank manager's testimony proved devastating. Financial records showing her rapid spending, luxury purchases made with inheritance money while claiming financial hardship. 3 withdrawals totaling $40,000, he confirmed. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, hotel stays. Not typical behavior for someone claiming dependency. I watched this systematic destruction of her case with quiet satisfaction. Not the violent triumph I'd once known, but something cleaner, more lasting. Justice working exactly as it should when truth faced manipulation. Elmira's final attempt at self-defense collapsed into emotional pleading. I loved Rufus. I deserve to be taken care of. Love is not a legal claim to property, Mrs. Burns. Judge Morrison's tone carried finality. Nor does marriage automatically transfer pre-existing assets. The gavel's sound echoed like thunder in the suddenly quiet courtroom. This court finds the plaintiff's ownership claims well documented and legitimate. The defendant's petition for property transfer is denied in its entirety. All disputed assets remain with Mr. Cornelius Burns. Victory tasted different than I'd expected. Not the savage satisfaction of destroying enemies, but the deeper pleasure of justice served through proper channels. My son would have approved of these methods. Elmira sat motionless, stunned by the completeness of her defeat. The woman who'd invaded my home with such confidence now looked small and broken, her greed finally exposed for what it was. Ira gathered our papers efficiently, already preparing post-trial documentation. Congratulations, Cornelius. The house remains yours, along with all other disputed assets. Thank you? The words felt inadequate for what he'd accomplished, but some gratitude transcended language. As we prepared to leave, Elmira remained seated, staring at the table where her dreams of easy money had died under legal scrutiny. She'd chosen the wrong battlefield and faced an opponent she'd never understood. The courtroom emptied slowly, observers dispersing with the subdued energy that followed conclusive legal proceedings. Justice had been served methodically, professionally, completely. Walking toward the courthouse exit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. The deep satisfaction of using all my abilities, including the dark ones, in service of something pure and right. The gavel fell. Justice was served. But Ira deserved to understand what had really happened here today. The courthouse steps felt different walking out as Victor, but Ira deserved the whole truth about what he'd witnessed. Ira, there are things about my past you should know. I paused beside his car, watching afternoon shadows stretch across downtown Chicago. Things that explain what happened in there. He studied my face, professional instincts reading subtext in my tone. I had suspicion something was unusual about today. Opposing counsel's behavior was unprecedented. We settled into his sedan, the enclosed space providing privacy for conversations that required careful handling. Some truths demanded proper settings. I used to be known as the Iron Fist in certain circles. The words came easier than expected, honesty feeling like relief after decades of careful concealment. Chicago's South Side, 40 years ago. I ran operations that weren't exactly legitimate business. Ira nodded slowly, processing this information with the same analytical calm he'd shown reviewing legal documents. That explains the opposing counsel's reaction. Grover must have recognized you from professional circles. Different kind of professional, but yes. I watched familiar neighborhoods pass outside the window, ordinary streets where extraordinary reputations still carried weight. I built an empire on fear and violence, but that was before Rufus changed everything. Children have that effect. His tone carried understanding without judgment. They make us want to become better than we were. Rufus never knew. I kept that life completely separate from his world. When he started school, I went legitimate, invested everything in clean businesses, built a respectable identity he could be proud of. The confession felt cathartic, sharing truth with someone who'd proven worthy of trust. Professional relationships required honesty, and Ira had earned complete transparency. The past is past, Cornelius. He turned onto my street, familiar houses marking the end of our journey together. Today, justice won through legitimate means. That's what matters. His acceptance meant more than he could know. Respect from someone who understood both law and complexity, who could separate past sins from present righteousness. Will this affect your willingness to work with me in the future? I asked as we pulled into my driveway. Are you planning any more legal battles? His slight smile suggested the question was rhetorical. Only if someone else tries to steal what belongs to my son. Then I look forward to working with you again. As we shook hands outside my front door, The house looked exactly the same as when this ordeal began. But everything had changed. Justice was served, Rufus's memory was protected, and I'd found redemption through methods he would have approved. The afternoon sun caught the windows, reflecting light like blessing on a home that remained secure in family hands. Elmira's greed had been defeated, her manipulation exposed, her claims destroyed through proper legal channels. Inside, Rufus's graduation photo still smiled from the mantel, but the pain had transformed into something else. Pride, perhaps. Satisfaction at protecting what he'd valued most. Integrity, justice, family love expressed through right action. I poured whiskey from the bottle we'd shared, raising a glass toward his image. Justice served, son. The clean way. The way you would have wanted. The grandfather clock chimed 4 o'clock, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next. But tonight, for the first time since the funeral, I would sleep peacefully. The house was truly mine, protected by law and defended through legitimate warfare. Rufus could rest, knowing his father had finally learned to fight the right battles with the right weapons. Victory through justice, redemption through truth, legacy protected through love. The story was complete. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.